Hi, I'm Daniel Zwerdling. David Shipler is away, so one of us, two reporters, starts now. And here's our mission today. We're going to learn how two of the most famous explorers from America lied to the world about the amazing things they had supposedly accomplished. And we're talking here about Frederick Cook and Robert E. Peary. Now, Peary and Cook basically scammed the public when each of them claimed a little over 100 years ago that he'd discovered the North Pole. At least most investigators have since concluded that they lied. Researchers have told some of these outrageous details before, but our guest today has written a book that takes this story further. He shows how the New York Times and another powerful newspaper actively spread the explorers' lies. It was fake news in the early 1900s. Darrell Hartman, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Daniel.
I think one of the lessons we're going to get out of this today is that when people really want to believe that something is true, it's hard to convince them to look at the facts. As you were researching this book, did you hear echoes between this hoax about the North Pole and about what's happening today, with politics and media like Fox and all the lies being spread today?
I did see parallels. That's one of the main reasons I wanted to do this book. Part of the book is about this split world of the American media at the turn of the century, where you had the so-called quality newspapers, they were actually called that at the time, which were geared towards a more educated, prosperous, establishment reading audience. And then you had the so-called popular press, which was the mass press. Far more readers, cheaper papers, very disruptive to the existing media landscape, and were generally, by the cultural elite, accused of being sensationalistic and untrustworthy, which they often were. There's this mix of credible and incredible and outlandish and sensible accusations being made, right? Because it was so hotly contested.
Yeah. One paper was basically saying, your explorer is lying about getting to the North Pole, kind of like election campaigns and media today.
And it really created these sort of tribal affiliations among the American public for one explorer versus the other. I saw a lot of echoes with the way contemporary politics works.
Darrell, your book is called Battle of Ink and Ice. Great title, by the way. A sensational story of news barons, North Pole explorers, and the making of modern media. Darrell, let's start back in time. Let's start in the late 1800s. Explorers had known for centuries that there must be a tippy top to the Earth, right, to the North Pole. And hundreds of explorers, does anybody know, maybe thousands, kept trying to find it and dying.
I think the deaths are probably in the high hundreds or low thousands. I've always been drawn to these old explorers' tales, these images of men sort of racing across the ice in their furs, and there's something very appealing about that in an old-fashioned kind of way.
Not appealing to me at all, excuse me. Cold, ice, no.
Well, to read about.
Yeah.
In front of a roaring fire.
Of course, when explorers eventually would get to the North Pole, they would find ice and more ice. Before I read your book, I didn't realize that there isn't any land at the North Pole. The North Pole is just ice that floats on the ocean.
Yes.
In any case, why did explorers risk their lives to get there over centuries?
So the answer to that question depends on the period you're talking about. In a period like the 1860s and the 1870s, there is some genuine mystery about what is up there. And you have some far-fetched but also kind of wonderful theories.
And what did they speculate?
Some legitimate scientists thought that it was actually temperate climate, that once you push through this ring of cold, challenging ice, you would get into this open polar sea. They expected to find things like whales and wildlife and maybe even some vegetation. They expected some of these geographers to find Inuit people living at the North Pole. And this was current for a while.
So part of it was just the quest for knowledge?
Yes, knowledge. I think an interesting contrast here, it would be to contrast the hunt for the North Pole with the hunt for the Northwest Passage, which dominated polar exploring for the early part of the 19th century. The Northwest Passage had a very concrete economic benefit. If you found a way through that Canadian Arctic by ship that was regular, that you could get through year after year, you would revolutionize international trade and shipping. And there are obvious commercial advantages to finding that route.
Of course, the most infamous expedition to find the Northwest Passage which, as you say, was a fantasy that didn't even exist, was the Franklin expedition in the 1840s.
Yes. I mean, it was infamous because it went so disastrously wrong.
Everybody on that expedition either froze to death or they starved.
Mostly starvation because the ships were trapped in ice and there was no help for miles and miles around.
And before we get to the North Pole itself, I want to play an excerpt of a moving sea chanty about that Franklin disaster.
For just one time, I would take the Northwest Passage to find the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea.
I want to play it partly because it's beautiful and partly because we need more music here on Two Reporters. This song was written and sung by a Canadian named Stan Rogers.
Westward from the Davis Strait is there 'twas said to lie the sea route to the Orient for which so many died. Seeking gold and glory, leaving weathered, broken bones, and a long
Stirring stuff. Yeah, wonderful.
You've never heard it before?
No.
That song gets me every time. And back to the North Pole.
The funny thing about finding the North Pole, there's not really much to be found there. You know, there was scientific things to be found. What can we learn about the topography and the geography of this area? But by the end of the 19th century, it truly had become a symbolic, almost athletic achievement. You had different nations and different individuals trying to get there for the bragging rights. And it really starts to just look like an endurance sport.
Well, it's interesting when I read what people of the time said about the expeditions to the North Pole. They would use words like pluck. You know, these explorers have pluck. That was a big word. Courage, bravery, heroism.
Absolutely.
It seemed to all be about, proving you were a man.
But it's absolutely true. You have these explorers embodying national traits, right? Kind of in the way we root for our Olympic athletes. You know, for example, Robert Peary, one of the major players in this North Pole controversy, was championed by President Theodore Roosevelt. And the main reason Roosevelt really liked Peary because he thought he embodied these so-called fighting virtues. Theodore Roosevelt was worried about a decline in manhood and strength and all these sort of characteristics he thought were important for Americans to have. In Robert Peary, he saw a figure who could inspire men to be tougher and stronger and to do great things on behalf of their nation. So it was a very symbolic thing.
Let's hold off on Peary just a few more moments. Let's focus on the late 1800s now. There were a few disastrous expeditions. One of them I know that you write about in your book was the Jeannette Polar Expedition in 1878. And the guy who owned one of the papers that ended up having this battle over, my explorer is right, your explorer is wrong, he funded this expedition. Tell us a little bit about the Jeannette and how it went down, not in flames, but in ice.
Yeah, well, the New York Herald is not around anymore. But in its period, in the 19th century, it was the most profitable American newspaper for quite some time, the most powerful newspaper of the United States. And one thing it was especially good at was exploring stories. And this is a legacy that had been created by James Gordon Bennett Jr., who edited and published the newspaper. And he did this very famous thing that some listeners will have heard about. He sent a correspondent named Henry Morton Stanley into deep, dark Africa to find the most famous living explorer of the day, Dr. David Livingstone, who'd gone missing. No one knew where he was. There were many fears that he was dead. And in fact, the Herald's correspondent went into the wilds of present-day Tanzania, Uganda, and found Livingstone and rescued him. So this created an enormous story, a famous incident in the history of newspaperdom, and it made a lot of money for the New York Herald.
And Daryl, when I read that, I was stunned because I think a lot of us, especially my era, grew up hearing about this famous moment when Stanley finds the old frail doctor who everybody thought had vanished, and he supposedly says, Dr. Livingstone, I presume? I had no idea that a newspaper, the New York Herald, they created this whole expedition.
Yes, and this is a huge turning point because it is really this first case where a newspaper doesn't just go out and report the news, it goes out and makes the news. And of course, when Stanley succeeded, the Herald has exclusive rights to the news because no other reporter has gone there to get the story. So this makes it both a very prestigious and a very profitable story, and something that the Herald is eager to replicate. In fact, there's a very interesting brief period in the 1870s in the wake of this huge story where several other newspapers, American newspapers and British newspapers, all start sending correspondents out in this sort of Indiana Jones style to go dig up lost cuneiform tablets in the Middle East and sort of find other lost treasures in hopes of scoring a big win like this. And I believe James Gordon Bennett wanted to do this all over again. And he tries several times to replicate the huge success of the Stanley Livingstone story. And this North Pole venture with the Jeanette is his next big attempt to do that.
So he decides, we want to be the ones who finance the expedition to discover the North Pole, right? So they buy this huge ship.
Yeah, so Bennett is one of the richest men on the planet from a newspaper fortune. Imagine that, right?
And excuse me, this is a little tangential, but is one of the Bennetts had built a giant yacht where they kept not just fine china and silver, but they had a living cow to provide fresh milk and cream every day for the owner?
Yes, this is Junior, who's a much more high-living, profligate newspaper owner than his father ever was.
So they want to go to the pole.
Yeah, so, I mean, part of the thinking here is that the Herald is so energetic and enterprising and powerful and profitable that it can do things that governments can't. And the Stanley Livingstone story has proven that. So James Gordon Bennett goes out and spends an enormous amount of money buying a ship, converting the ship to make it Arctic ready, working with this naval lieutenant, George Washington DeLong, getting a crew together, getting officers together. The U.S. Navy is involved in this, but the U.S. Navy does not pay 1 cent for this expedition. It is entirely privately financed by James Gordon Bennett Jr., so it's an interesting mix of public-private collaboration. The goal is to get to the North Pole, but Bennett has kind of mixed motives here because, as I said, he really wants to replicate that Stanley Livingstone moment. And it just so happens that there is a Swedish explorer who is trying to complete the Northeast Passage above Siberia who hasn't been heard from in some time. So Bennett here does this very dangerous thing, which is to ask DeLong to go try to find this Swedish explorer, Nordenskjöld. And I think this contributes to the disaster that befalls the Jeanette.
It turns out that the captain and a bunch of his men froze to death, right?
True, yes.
The people who went to try to find the people on this ship found evidence that the starving men had eaten their boot leather.
Yes, they tried to eat just about everything down to their boot leather. Yeah.
And they were so desperate for heat that they literally put their feet directly into the fire?
Yes, they're freezing, they're starving, they're not thinking straight. It's a really tragic tale. It sort of points to the perils of a newspaper leading an expedition. He gets distracted, wastes time trying to create this giant story. And this is part of the reason that the Jeanette runs into big trouble. They end up being a part of one of the great survival or non-survival stories in the annals of Arctic history.
And here's one of the many, 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 many things that blows my mind. This newspaper titan, James Bennett Jr., does not proclaim, "Oh my gosh, I'm so broken up that I sent a shipload of men to freeze and starve to death." Instead, he's more determined than ever to find another explorer who's willing to risk his life to get to the North Pole.
Well, I mean, he did. The thing I would point out is that there were a good 20 years between that Jeanette disaster and Bennett's next actual foray into polar exploring.
And lucky for him, there are two explorers waiting in the wings in the early 1900s, Frederick Cook and Robert E. Peary. Describe them, please.
Sure. So Robert Peary and Frederick Cook end up being bitter enemies, but for a time they're quite close friends, and they even do an expedition together. I'll start with Robert Peary. Robert Peary was born in 1856. He grew up in Maine. He goes to Bowdoin College and joins the Navy. He's a naval engineer. That is his training and background. But he's a man who really wants to make a name for himself, and he wants to make a name for himself as an explorer. He says explicitly that he wants fame and recognition.
Let me just interrupt to say that I scribbled down a line that you have in your book. He wrote his mother.
Yes.
Remember, I'm quoting, "Remember, mother, I must have fame." I mean, he told his mother.
He did put it all out there. And he chooses the Arctic field to do this in. we have to remember this is a time when there were still places to be discovered, and being the first person to get to some of these undiscovered places was a huge deal, would lead to fame and riches.
Another thing that amazed me about him, though, is that here he had, for the military, been doing exploring, surveying in Nicaragua in Central America because they were trying to find a good route for the Interocean Canal, which of course ended up being built in Panama, not Nicaragua. But what I kept wondering was, here you are in a jungle, you're in, the tropics, beautiful beaches, sand, tropical animals. Why on earth would he want to go to a frozen wasteland, the North Pole? But I guess the answer is he craved fame.
Yes, he went where the opportunities took him. And when they took him to Nicaragua, he went to Nicaragua. And when they took him to Greenland, he went to Greenland. Okay,
let's go to Frederick Cook. What motivated him?
I think it's important to know, both Peary and Cook come from fairly humble backgrounds, and both lost their fathers at a young age. Robert Peary came from a sort of depressed middle-class background. Frederick Cook really came from a poor background after his father died. Frederick Cook was the son of German immigrants. His family name was originally Koch, K-O-C-H, changed, anglicized to Cook.
Uh-huh.
He grew up in the Catskills region of New York in a large family, which was, as I said, fatherless at a certain point, scrounging for every last penny it could get. And he moved to New York City as a teenager and basically put himself through medical school by making early morning milk deliveries. There was a sort of a dairy farming background with his family in the Catskills, and he made this business work with his tireless energy and ambition to becoming a doctor. His first wife died in childbirth, so he suffered this extremely sad sort of moment in his life, and he was sort of disconsolate, and his physician's business was not doing very well in Brooklyn. So it's at this point that he becomes kind of enamored of the Arctic and this idea of traveling to the far north. And he finds an advertisement in a newspaper that was placed by Robert Peary looking for people to join him on an expedition to the far north. So Frederick Cook sort of inspired by this, and Robert Peary needing a surgeon or someone with medical expertise to be on the expedition, the two of them meet and they travel together for the first time.
I don't want to psychoanalyze too much, but I wonder if being a doctor and having your wife and child die in childbirth and feeling that helplessness that I couldn't save them, I wonder if this could have been, I'm seriously, part of his, overwhelming need to prove himself at the North Pole.
That could be. I do think the losing of a father and this sort of being asked to take care of a family at a young age is in there too. But this was not a time when either of these characters were psychoanalyzing themselves very much, so we have to speculate.
But of course, we don't have to speculate about Peary's motives. I must be famous, as he wrote his mother. And from reading your book, I gather that Peary was so obsessed with becoming famous by finding the North Pole that he kept launching one expedition after another, even though he kept failing. And he almost died on one of them.
So Peary is usually a very cautious explorer in some ways. He's a very ambitious, tough guy who will stop at nothing to meet his goal. But he doesn't take silly risks. And this is the one time where he really takes a silly risk. He does that because he believes that a Norwegian team is competing with him to get to the pole. This is a figment of Peary's imagination. He's this sort of paranoid competitor. The Norwegians are indeed there, but they're doing scientific work. They're not trying to get to the North Pole. But Peary makes this mad dash in December, which is one of the coldest times. It's entirely dark. This is something he would never otherwise do. As a result of this miscalculation, he suffers severe frostbite. And he arrives in this hut that he's been trying to get through the dark after this long sort of dog sled expedition. And when he's in the hut, his assistant helps him to sit down. He complains, Peary does, of a sort of wooden feeling in his legs. And so his assistant pulls off Peary's fur socks. And as he's pulling the socks off his feet, 7 or 8 toes come off with the socks. They've basically been frozen, brittle, and taken off. And so he now has to sort of abandon the mission and get these feet taken care of. And there is a sort of reunion later in this expedition with Frederick Cook, because Robert Peary's backers back in the United States and his wife as well, Josephine, are very concerned about him and the fact that he has not come back. So they send a relief expedition up to check on Peary. And they find him here with his toes missing. And Frederick Cook goes with that expedition and has sort of his last face-to-face meeting with Robert Peary, where he sort of takes a look at him and tells Peary frankly that he's not in good shape, and he tries to get Peary to come home. Robert Peary, being Robert Peary, says, no, I'm going to keep trying.
So Peary has thrown down the gauntlet, in effect, and he wants to get to the North Pole first. And Cook basically says, no, I'm going to get to the pole first. Well, it takes a lot of money to organize an expedition to find the North Pole. And you say in your book that the way these explorers got their financing reflects, first of all, the kind of men they were. And second, it reflects some of the economic divisions in society.
Yeah, so Robert Peary really embodies the sort of East Coast establishment. He's very career-oriented. He works his way up through the Navy, and he develops these friends in high places. The high places are usually New York City or Washington, D.C., and he is just good at politicking in this way. And he's backed by millionaires, basically, is the simple way of putting it.
They were financiers, a railroad baron, people like that.
A lot of them have fortunes related to the railroads, banking. His biggest backer, Morris Jessup, made his money this way and is also known as a founder of the YMCA in America, a sort of devout Christian.
And when financiers would ask Robert E. Peary, why should we give a bunch of money for your expedition? He had a very interesting pitch.
He didn't have a ton of personal charm, but he was an effective pitchman. And so he had this great line. He said, the only thing people really remember about King Ferdinand was that he sent Columbus to America. And he had a point, right? These railroad barons and tycoons have made huge fortunes, and yet in the case of many of them, they haven't necessarily left a big legacy. They've just earned a lot of money. So he's really appealing to their egos, to their desire to sort of have their name associated with a great feat. And of course, reaching the North Pole was considered a great, great feat. And the other thing about Peary's backers is many of them are Republican. It's almost a little Republican club. I don't want that to overshadow the conversation too much because Republican and Democrat meant different things back then. But he's basically Republican. Whereas Frederick Cook, his associations and his personality are both different. Frederick Cook is a Democrat. Frederick Cook is not able to cultivate this group of bankers and businessmen the way that Robert Peary is able to cultivate them. Frederick Cook is a bit less famous, and he has to take sort of a scrappier approach to getting to the Arctic. He'll do such things as guiding big game hunts in order to get up there. He'll lead little tour groups, and he'll just do whatever it takes in order to undertake these expeditions, whereas Peary is much more disciplined and planned and almost sort of corporate in his organization.
Well, so let me summarize what happens next, please. Frederick Cook sets off for the North Pole first in this new competition between him and Robert Peary. Cook leaves in 1907, is it?
Cook leaves in 1907, very quietly, it should be noted, very quietly. No one really knows he has left.
And he has a tiny crew.
Yes.
Then Robert Peary sets off a year later on a far bigger expedition. I mean, he has, how many teams of men did he have?
When he's eventually on the ice, it's something like 24 other people with him, a combination of Inuit guides and white explorers.
And dozens of sled dogs, too, right?
Oh, dozens and dozens of sled dogs, yes.
Nobody hears from either explorer for months and months. Who knows if they're still alive? And then on what fateful day, Frederick Cook sends a cable. He says he reached the North Pole a year earlier, which would make him the first man in history to get there. And he's just come back to civilization.
So September 1st, 1909, Frederick Cook is in the windblown remote Shetland Islands. He both announces he has reached the North Pole and offers the exclusive story to the New York Herald by cable in the same 10 minutes. So he makes that offer at the same time. He hears back from the Herald. They have accepted his exclusive offer. They asked for the story to be cabled. And based on that sort of cable agreement, he's in business with the Herald. And this is international news. This is international front page headlines, basically.
There's a great newsreel of him, unfortunately without sound. A newsreel of Cook and comrades getting off a ship in Copenhagen. Most of the men are wearing top hats and tails. Cook has a kind of sailor's cap instead of the top hat, but otherwise they're all really dressed up. There are the Danish princes with them, crowds and brass band are on shore.
I mean, the top-hatted gentlemen are the dignitaries sort of greeting him. the interesting thing about Cook, he didn't really have an exploring party. Unlike Peary. Peary had a big core of explorers who went with him. Frederick Cook had one companion who was the sort of cook or chef from the yacht that brought him up there, and a couple Inuit, and that was it. So when he comes back, it's just him. The Inuit have stayed in Greenland. The cook has returned home because he didn't do very well. And Frederick Cook, the explorer, is by himself. So you see him there in that wonderful newsreel footage being greeted by an American diplomat, the Crown Prince of Denmark, and other figures like that.
Okay, and now the media frenzy begins. James Bennett and his New York Herald have embraced Frederick Cook as the man who discovered the North Pole. They have his exclusive rights. And I loved the Herald's banner headlines. Here's one: "Fighting famine and ice, the courageous explorer reaches the great goal." And for a few days, as you said a moment ago, this is worldwide news.
It's worldwide news for everyone, and basically everyone is on board.
There are banquets and more headlines. And then this next part could really be a corny movie. Only 2 days after Cook comes back in triumph, supposedly from the North Pole, he's literally in the middle of a banquet to honor him, and a whisper starts going around the room.
Yes, and a messenger comes in the door and hands this telegram to Frederick Cook. Frederick Cook, in the middle of this busy room, stands up and reads the telegram aloud, and is a telegram from Robert Peary, "Stars and Stripes nailed to the pole." So in the middle of this celebration of Frederick Cook's discovery, Robert Peary is also saying he has been to the North Pole. And this is, for a couple of days, great news, right? The American public is thrilled that not one, but two Americans have now gone to the North Pole. To be clear, Frederick Cook claims to have gone there in 1908, and then he gets stuck in the Arctic for a year. He's not able to get back to so-called civilization. Robert Peary claims to go a year later, 1909. So, if you believe these guys, Frederick Cook beat Peary by a year, but they both went. So there's a few days of sort of celebration of this twin achievement. And then everything changes because Robert Peary will accuse Frederick Cook of lying and say Frederick Cook's never been anywhere near the North Pole. He's a fraud.
And you sent me a clip of Robert Peary speaking, giving a speech extraordinary because it's one of the few things we have from that time that brings him to life. Let's hear this for a moment.
In the discovery of the North Pole is written the final chapter of the last of the great geographical stories of the Western Hemisphere, which began with the discovery of the New World by Columbus. The discovery of the North Pole on the 6th of April, 1909, by the last expedition of the Peary Arctic Club, means that the splendid frozen jewel of the North, for which through centuries men of every nation have struggled and suffered and died, is won at last and is to be worn forever by the Stars and Stripes.
This is terrible to say, but he sounds kind of East Coast and effete.
I think all those guys, they all seem to have these sort of thin voices, and like Theodore Roosevelt, for example, did have a kind of high-pitched voice. It might also be something in the recording technology that sort of speeds them up and makes them...
Could well be.
They're less manly than you expect, put it that way.
In any case, the New York Herald has embraced Frederick Cook, but now the New York Times decides to embrace Robert Peary and his claims. The owner of the Times was a man named Adolph Ox, and he and the Times were generally more careful journalistically than Bennett and the Herald. But in this case, it turns out that Ox and the New York Times actually helped finance Peary's expedition before he even set sail.
The New York Times has gotten into business with Peary in a year earlier.
Well, and I mean, it's so horrendously unethical, at least in view of today, and I think even then. Right?
It does. I think at the time it was a little more common, but it definitely would have been a conflict. No one anticipated that this huge controversy would arise out of this, and there would be so many doubts about where these explorers did and didn't go. But there is an inherent sort of potential conflict here, absolutely.
So why did these two powerful newspapers and newspaper magnates champion Cook versus Peary at all?
James Gordon Bennett, I think, had the spirit of the adventurer in him. He liked to drive fast horses. In fact, he almost killed himself in a horse carriage accident. He liked to race fast boats. In fact, he won this remarkable transatlantic race across to England in December in 1867, which shows a real sort of tough sporting spirit, even though he was sort of rich and paid people to do the sailing for him. So I think with Bennett, he actually had a sort of longing to do these things, or at least be involved in them. And then, of course, there was the prestige of backing the explorer who discovers the North Pole and beating all the other newspapers to the story. With Adolf Ochs, I think his personality, his temperament is a little more cautious. He does not have this background in adventuring. He comes from a very modest background. He's the son of Bavarian Jewish immigrants. The times that Adolf Ochs is shaping into one of the great newspapers of America, it wants to be the sort of official outlet, really, of American government and finance and achievement. It really wants to be the establishment paper, and Robert Peary is the establishment explorer. So they make great bedfellows. And this is a time when the New York Times is totally on the upswing thanks to the efforts of Adolf Ochs. He's rescued it from bankruptcy. And I think for him, the Times being affiliated with this great scientific achievement, the discovery of the North Pole, will really be the cherry on top.
You know, we probably should stress that in those days, an estimated 90% of adults in America read newspapers. So newspaper stories had huge impact.
Yes.
And now the New York Times and the New York Herald start attacking each other. Each essentially charges our explorer is telling the truth. But can you really believe the other newspaper and their explorer?
You know, Robert Peary is really leading. He's the one directing this and creating a lot of anger because he's being so blunt about it. You know, his famous line, he said, "Cook has handed the public a gold brick." That is a sort of period slang for a con man. And this is the type of language no one's ever really questioned what these explorers claim to have done. They're considered honorable men. This is a great victory for America, so the American press is generally on board with it. So the newspapers of America start attacking Robert Peary for his uncouthness, for his nastiness, and of course, the Herald, defending Frederick Cook, is leading that charge, and the Herald has no problem getting loud and noisy and fighting back. That is in the Herald's DNA. And the New York Times is in a funny position because that is not in the Times' DNA. The Times has been designed by Ochs, and in fact the founders of the paper who came before him, to be temperate, to be careful in its accusations, and to be this sort of sober-minded institution of elite cultured New Yorkers. But it is definitely challenging this claim of Frederick Cook's, and that fact alone puts the Times out there on a limb. The Times is taking some heat here because they have the gumption, they have the gall to question the honesty of Frederick Cook.
And what were the allegations? What was the reporting that said Cook is a liar? He never got to the pole.
Well, it's important to note the Cook is a liar stuff took a while to germinate because it was so outlandish to think that someone would lie about this massive claim. It's kind of about saying you're the first person to get to the moon and lying about it. Although I know there is supposedly a conspiracy theory about that. But all that to say, the Cook is a liar thing took a while to gain momentum, to gain steam. In the early days, there was just some mild questioning about why hasn't he shown his sextant readings? Why hasn't he shown these various observations and travel records that he should have brought back with him? Why have the scientific experts not yet been given access to these very important papers?
I mean, that was zany. You mentioned that Cook didn't show his sextant readings. Isn't that the gizmo that sailors and others use to measure the distance between a star and a planet and the horizon to know where they are on Earth?
Very difficult to do. You need a certain type of weather. You need the skills.
But he wouldn't show people his readings. He wouldn't show his daily diaries. Crazy. And his daily diaries would have shown, in theory, here's where we started today and here's where we end up. Day by day.
It was always not only important to see the readings and the notes, but the equipment itself, right? So the equipment could be tested for accuracy, and Cook had various excuses for why he could not do this. He started out saying they were in Greenland, then he said he had duplicates, and he said he didn't have duplicates, then he said you'd have to wait for the book. It's a publishing reason that I can't give you this information. So very much a moving target and hard to pin down Frederick Cook when it came to documentation.
So basically, the New York Herald and the people who supported Cook along with them were going out on a limb and saying, this guy is the first person to ever get to the North Pole, based almost entirely, or maybe entirely, on Cook saying, that's what I did.
Yes.
With zero evidence to show for it.
Yes. You know, back then, I think someone's reputation was important. Frederick Cook did have something of a reputation as a competent Arctic explorer. He wasn't some random guy from Cincinnati, who learned a dog sled a year before. But, everything from his dates to his, sled design was called into question and held up as an example of, well, he could have done it, or held up as an example of, well, he couldn't have done it. And some people did some very deep dives into the amount of food he claimed to have brought, the weight of the cargo he was hauling on the sleds, and whether that would have worked. They took out their maps, they took out their compasses. It really created a bunch of armchair analysts in America, some of whom had real scientific expertise, many of whom did not.
And the New York Times and Adolph Fox were behind a lot of this reporting. They kept reporting it not just day after day, but month after month. And one of the extraordinary things to me is how there seemed to be no firewall between the executives who ran the New York Times and the guy they were backing, Robert E. Peary. I mean, Peary, as you write about in your book, had frequent communications with one of the executives of the New York Times,
William Reich.
They sort of plotted, here's how we can attack Cook. I mean, this is outlandish to think now that would go on at a respectable media company.
Absolutely. They were completely hand in glove. At the time, I think, people observing this knew that the Times was backing Peary financially and had a stake in his success, but I don't think anyone knew the degree to which they were working together. This was largely done in secret.
And meanwhile, the New York Herald was also attacking the New York Times with outlandish headlines and attacking Peary. And what were the claims against Peary, implying that Peary had not reached the pole?
Well, they didn't have a lot of information about Peary. And frankly, Peary wasn't doubted to the extent that Cook was. I think people just thought his behavior was appalling. He was a bad sport. He was a sore loser. That was the sort of grounds for Peary's unpopularity. But Frederick Cook was withholding his evidence. Robert Peary was withholding his own evidence as well for a time. And he gave different reasons for this. He said, well, if I put all my travel information out there and all my astronomical observations out there, Frederick Cook is just going to take them and copy them and use them to support his bogus claim. So no one was putting the information out there. There was very little transparency. Robert Peary eventually brought his travel records to the National Geographic Society, which was considered fairly reputable and a decent adjudicator of this issue. They claimed that they believed he had gotten there, which was huge news. It sort of was the stamp of approval for Robert Peary. But it wasn't known at the time what exactly the National Geographic Society looked at.
And as you point out, the committee that examined his evidence was made up of respectable men, but who had backed Peary from the beginnings, and they were not impartial at all.
And this was known within a small group. It didn't really reach the American public. The fact that this panel of experts judging Peary's travel records had supported his expeditions in the past. They had lobbied for him to receive National Geographic Society funding. At least one of them was also a Navy man. There were many conflicts of interest that would have been easy to call out at that time.
One of the most remarkable things about this whole chapter is that the fight over, which man was telling the truth became a political battle as well. In Congress, there were investigations, right, which were prompted by the fact that the New York Times was lobbying Congress. This is another extraordinary thing about the press meddling. The New York Times was lobbying Congress to give Peary a big promotion, to big retirement, make him an admiral. And Democrats were resisting.
Yes.
And they were sort of grilling him at a congressional hearing, basically saying, prove that you got to the pole.
Yeah.
And the Republicans were outraged.
And Daniel, before I get into the hearings, can I just talk a little bit about the political divide during the controversy?
Yeah.
So throughout this fall of 1909, when Robert Peary is disparaging Frederick Cook, and it has to be said, Frederick Cook is behaving very honorably and declining to take the bait. He's saying only nice things about Robert Peary. So this enhances Cook's reputation among the American public. They really think he's a stand-up guy.
He was going around giving lectures, getting paid thousands of dollars.
Right.
And big crowds would turn out to see him.
Frederick Cook was the most popular man in America the fall of 1909. His lectures sold out. Everyone loved to hear him talk. They wanted a piece of Frederick Cook. Observers pointed out that he was earning upwards of $10,000 per lecture, and he was just making himself rich off a feat that he had yet to prove.
And wait, and that's $10,000 in today's money?
No, that's that period's money.
Wow, incredible. Superstar.
Yes, he was a superstar. He was very much in demand. And he was especially popular in these kind of democratic strongholds. You had a period when democratic populism was sweeping the nation. You had a real backlash from the farm states and the southern states against this so-called East Coast establishment. And when you look at the geography of Cook's support and the geography of his lecture tours, he's really popular outside that sort of eastern seaboard. Whereas Robert Peary's support, what support he does enjoy, is really concentrated in New England and the Washington, D.C. area. So this political divide, this partisan divide that we know so much about today, is absolutely playing out in this controversy of 1909. And then it will get explicitly political. Robert Peary, as he's taking his victory lap, Congress, specifically Democrats in Congress, really want to grill Robert Peary. And I'm not sure it's that they really doubt he's been to the North Pole. They just want to make him pay his dues for being a bad American, and for all these pushy Republican supporters of his, and his friends at the New York Times have really pushed for him to be handsomely rewarded for discovering the North Pole. And the Democrats in Congress are sort of like, wait a minute, not so fast. And what this does is it creates some hearings that Robert Peary very much wanted to avoid, and some intense questioning and interrogating of his claim. That turns out to be hugely consequential, because the later scholars who are going to dig deep into Peary's claim, their first point of reference in many cases is going to be those congressional hearings, which is the only public moment where Peary gave some of these details away.
Well, this all became a very sad story, both for Robert E. Peary and for Frederick Cook. And I guess we shouldn't go into all the details, because I want people to read your wonderful book, Battle of Ink and Ice. Really fascinating. But just to put a few things together, Cook ended up in prison, and people went back and looked at the claims that Cook had made before the Arctic expedition, that he had been the first person to get to the summit of Mount McKinley in the northwest of the United States. They were able to prove that that was a lie. And some people close to Peary said he became a broken man.
There's just a lot there. But yeah, your point, the 1909 controversy specifically, I think, took a huge mental health toll, as we would call it nowadays, on both men.
So how close did Peary and Cook actually get to the pole? What do researchers now think?
Well, to me, the most credible conclusions, and these involve a bit of guesswork, but the most credible conclusions show that Robert Peary was somewhere in the vicinity of 30 to 60 miles away, which is close. And Cook was probably somewhere between 400 and 500 miles from the pole.
Oh.
There is pretty strong evidence showing he really didn't get that far from Land's End.
If you could talk to Peary right now and to Cook, do you think they would say that I genuinely thought I had reached the North Pole? I mean, I was in the area. I mean, it's an amazing feat, whatever they accomplished, to go way up there near the North Pole and survive and make it back.
Do you mean what they would tell me, or do you mean what would they be thinking?
What would they be thinking?
That's a great question. Frederick Cook is such an enigma. I think he would say I didn't go there. And I think Robert Peary would know that he also wasn't sure. I think they both deep down knew. I think one interesting takeaway from this story, Daniel, is just the pressure of competition also. I'm not sure Peary was planning to claim he'd reached the pole. I honestly don't know, but I think that Frederick Cook's brazen claim, which I think Peary strongly believed to be completely ludicrous, he was so outraged by that claim of Cook's that the only move that he thought he had was to say, no, I got there, and I'm going to use that platform to demolish your claim. This is really a story of rivalry, not only between the explorers, but between the papers.
One of the most remarkable things about this whole tale, and I keep saying the word remarkable, I think, because there are lots of remarkable things, is that the New York Times did not officially apologize or run a correction about the fact that it had backed Peary, and people decided that Peary had not gotten to the North Pole, probably. I mean, I know there's still debate today, even about Cook. But the New York Times did not really come clean about all this until the late 1980s.
I would revise your language a little, Daniel, because
Please.
I don't think it was a matter of coming clean. I don't think the Times really knew that it had made a mistake. I would accuse it of being a little incurious about Robert Peary's claim. When he went before Congress, for example, and revealed a couple questionable things about his record keeping, the Times didn't blink. They supported him fully all the way.
Clearly, the New York Times threw their lot in with Robert Peary and his story, maybe a little too enthusiastically, as it turned out.
Yes, the Times was happy to cast stones on Frederick Cook, but it never really looked too hard at its own man. But it did end up having to issue, it's got to be one of the most incredible corrections in the history of the New York Times. We're talking 80 years later, 1988.
Do you have the New York Times apology there?
Yes.
Please recite a little bit of that.
It runs 3 paragraphs. The juicy one really is the last paragraph. It goes like this. Peary's expedition was sponsored by the National Geographic Society. The Times had exclusive global rights to the story. Thus, both may have failed to scrutinize adequately what they yearned to believe. The error was doubtless committed in good faith, but most authorities today agree that no one has an untainted claim to be first. So that was how the Times sort of cleaned up its previous position on this whole thing.
I'm laughing only because I'm trying to picture how many people, how many executives, and how many hours sat in a room to write that.
Crafting that, exactly. This was 80 years after this original news story, and many people had to die, and many archives had to be opened, and many scholars needed to spend many, many, many hours looking at the evidence. I think to the Times' credit, it is willing to correct the record. And this goes to the Times seeing itself as the paper of record and to be seen as the authority on what in fact did happen and didn't in American history.
There's a footnote to the story that I find quite moving. And it doesn't really matter whether you believe that Peary and his team got to the North Pole or just close to it. His main aide was Matthew Henson, a black man whose parents had been slaves, freed slaves. And when Peary claims, I was the first person to get to the North Pole, even if it's all a lie, he wasn't the first person to get to where he claims is the North Pole. It was Matthew Henson, a black man.
Yes. Who traveled ahead as the trailbreaker. Isn't that incredible? He traveled ahead of Peary, and wherever Peary went, Henson went first. That was kind of the way it worked, especially at this late stage in Peary's career, where he's only got 2 toes left and he doesn't walk as well. There's a lot of fixation on this sort of prize of the North Pole. I would say Matthew Henson's entire career is really the especially incredible thing. I mean, he was said to be the best non-Inuit driver of sled dogs on the planet. He learned the Inuit language, which Robert Peary never really bothered to do. I think Henson found a sort of home in the Arctic among the Inuit on the one side who accepted him for who he was. They accepted him and loved being able to communicate with him. And he had a sort of mean but loyal boss in Robert Peary. And the Arctic was really kind of a different space where he could live life a different way. And it's striking to see when Matthew Henson returns to the United States after these expeditions, how quickly his life starts turning back into the disadvantaged life of a black man in America at this time. His lecture fees are far lower. He has to beg Robert Peary to be able to give a talk or two, to be able to borrow some photographs, to make a living off of this incredible journeying that he's done with Peary. So he comes back to the U.S. It's a really kind of reality check there. I do believe that Matthew Henson in recent years has become more of a known entity, which is overdue. His accomplishments have become more widely known. So it's nice to see that happening. But when it comes to the North Pole, if you have to prove that Peary got there, you've got to prove that Henson got there.
Darrell Hartman's book is called Battle of Ink and Ice, a sensational story of news barons, North Pole explorers, and the making of modern media. Darrell, thank you so much. This is fascinating.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, Audible, and pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at our website, tworeporters.com. David Shipler will be back soon. I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.